you born?
1900.
Where?
Batavia, no, Pavilion, on a farm outside in Genesee County.
Oh, is that right?
And Pavilion, New York. And my father was born in 1850, if you can imagine that.
My golly.
And he taught, they weren't high schools in those days as we have them today. And he went to the Tenbrook Free Academy over in Cattaraugus County, and it must have been probably 1974. He finished in 1874, and then he started teaching school in one-room schoolhouses.
My golly.
And for 21 years he did that in Genesee County before he met my mother. And during that time, the family had come from Scotland, and I know that he went back a couple of times, but I never had a chance to really find out from him what relatives we had over in Scotland.
Right.
And I went over there in '71 with Stan Weeks and played golf, and then I went over in '73 and with Faith, and we just went around the country, but I couldn't really establish much of any connections. So.
Now, he would have been then 46 when you were born.
Huh?
He was 46 years old when you were born then,
Yes,
right?
yes.
Now, your mother, how old was she?
She was, there was 13 years difference between the two of them. And she'd been brought up on a farm out in East Pembroke, that's west of Batavia, on a farm. And she went to the Boston Conservatory of Music, and was, she always played the piano, and she had 4 brothers, all of whom had good voices.
Is that right?
And she married my father, and there were 3 of us boys, and not one of us knew where middle C was. But fortunately, I think my daughter, Hope, has picked up some of the attributes that my mother had, which is good. She plays the piano.
So you grew up around Batavia then, right?
Yes. We left the farm when I was 5 years old, and I went to Batavia, and that's where I went to school. And I finished high school there in 1918, became a member of the YMCA, learned to swim, went to the summer camp. But aside from that, I don't remember too much about Batavia, because when I finished school, it was 1918, and in 1918, if you didn't go into the service, the war was still on. You went to what was known as the SATC, Student Army Training Corps, and I went into that. And 2 of our dormitories were converted into barracks, and we had a lieutenant, Army lieutenant from the South in each one of them, and we went through the fundamental training for soldiers. I'll never forget the bayonet practice, because this lieutenant was up on the stage. You got to make a terrible face. But it only lasted 2 months, so I was out after 2 months. And Armistice Day came in November of that year, and then
And today, by the way, is Armistice Day.
Huh?
And
Yeah,
today is Armistice
that's
Day.
right. So that was 1918.
Now, you got to tell the story for the tape, what happened in 1912 with your dad in Batavia when you saw the candidate, Teddy Roosevelt.
Oh, yes. Well, it was 1912, and he was running for office, and he was in a great big car up in the back seat. And my father lifted me up, and I shook hands with Teddy Roosevelt. And his granddaughter, you know, was the wife of the Roosevelt who was president, Franklin. Mm-hmm. And I was very much interested in that book, No Ordinary Time, if you remember.
Right.
And after I finished that 600-page book, I got one of his wife's biography. Mm-hmm. But it was very interesting, but she didn't tell a lot of the things that happened that were told about her when he was president. Or how, that's what I had hoped to find. Yeah. But it was great. And
so you finished 1918. You finished that school, and did you go to college then, John?
I went to Hamilton College. That was my first 2 months in Hamilton College.
Okay.
And the upperclassmen came back, and most of the upperclassmen were in the service, and those who did come back still had their army coats, and they wore the army coats around college for the next couple of years. One of them was Jack Bratton, Dan Bratton's father.
I'll be darned.
So I remember him. And then I used to see him once in a while down at Nyack, New York. He was on the community college board down there, and we used to have meetings once in a while. So when Dan Bratton came to Chautauqua, I told him. He was surprised. And he came from a little place in southeastern New York State where he and his father used to go into watch the Dodgers baseball team.
That's right.
He was a great baseball fan. Those were early days.
Now, Hamilton College, was that any relation to John Hamilton?
Not at all. Hamilton College was formed, the charter was drawn by Alexander Hamilton for the Hamilton Oneida Academy for the Indians. And it became a college in 1812. But my great uncle went there as a student in the academy in 1810. And his son went to Hamilton College, all on my mother's side of the family. And he was salutatorian of the 1849 class. He became a minister and a missionary. He started the mission over in the Philippines, the Presbyterian Church. And the family name was not Hamilton. My mother's name was it'll come to me. Oh, that's strange. I know it just as well as I know my own. Anyway, as I said before, she had these 4 brothers who sang. And what was her name? I know it just. I should know it as well as I know my own. It'll come to me as we talk on. Yeah.
Now, after school, then you got out of graduated from Hamilton College. Then what happened to John next?
Then I thought I wanted to go into a bank, and I went into. And I during my high school days, and from my age 11 on, I bought my own clothes. They only cost $5 for a suit of clothes, and I paid for them by the month, the man who had the store. And my father had tuberculosis, and he was in bed for a couple of years. It was tough for my mother. So I this man that I worked for in the grocery store said, when he thought I wanted to go to a bank, he said, why don't you go with me up to Buffalo? He said, the branch of the Federal Reserve Bank had opened in 1919 of the New York Bank, and he knew the man in charge. He was from Warsaw, New York. And he said, well, I could find a job for you here if you wanted, but if I were a young man, he said, I'd go out to a small country bank and learn it from the ground up. So the same man over in Warsaw, a friend of his, owned the Pavilion Banking Company, which was a private bank, and I spent my first day in banking in Pavilion in the township in which I was born, the second. Then I was transferred over to Wyoming, New York. I don't know whether you ever heard, right near Warsaw. Mm-hmm. And so I was there that winter, and I was only 18, 19 years old, and there was a man in Batavia that was building a sidewalk, a road, a concrete road from the village down to the railroad station, about a mile. And so I drove his truck with a half a dozen workmen, and I kept their time in the morning, and then when I got out of the bank, I kept their time and drove them home to Batavia. But that was only for that winter, and then this man in Warsaw had bought a bank, an Arcade, and so I went over to Arcade, but the man in charge, as cashier, had run a hitch barn. You know what a hitch barn is?
No, what's that?
Well, where the farmers hitched their horse and buggies in a great big building, and then they did their shopping. So I left. In February, I told the man in Warsaw I was quitting. He told his friends he's just a young college boy. He wants to get ahead too fast. And I went back to Batavia for a couple of weeks, and I answered an ad in the paper for a bank job in Kenmore, New York. That's where I was. For the next 4 or 5 years, I went to the American Institute of Banking branch there and studied for the bank examiners, and I became a bank examiner in 1927 and was shipped down to New York. That's where I was. And that was then, of course, the Great Depression came, 27, 28, 29. Mm-hmm. 1929, we were examining the Bankers Trust Fund. You could go over into the stock, where the stock exchange was. I didn't see anybody jumping out of windows. But 29, I had met Faith, as she'd been teaching up in Westchester. And so another gal who taught in the same school was a classmate of my younger brothers in high school, and they had been going together. And whenever they went home at the end of a season, they always went to a show, and the Showboat was on that night. And as it happened, my older brother, who had also dated her, he was traveling for a drug company. We had dinner together, and then we went up, and when she went to the show, after the show, I went up after her alone and took her over to the ferry. Her father was a minister out in New Jersey, and I met him for the first time. But then a couple of years later, in 1929, Faith and I decided to get married, but we didn't want to live in New York, so I was transferred to Rochester, and that's where I was. And 1932, I there was an opening for a bank which had closed in Canandaigua, New York, and they needed all the vice presidents had been dealing in the stock market, and they were all let out, and the bank reopened, and the former president of the bank came back as chairman of the board. That was 1932. I went with the bank as a vice president. He died in 34, and I was made president, so I really was president of 3 different banks. And I retired in 69, and that was after I had come to Jamestown. And I was president of the bank, the Old National Chautauqua County Bank, in 1948, and then I stayed on there until 69, and then I completed 47 years in banking and retired in 1969. And then that was October 1st, and at that time the Gebbie Foundation had started, and I was one of the original 5 members of the firm. Mrs. Bellinger was very active in the Chautauqua Foundation and helped save Chautauqua back in the 30s. And through her, I was named on that board, and I was served as president of the Chautauqua Foundation. I served for 3 or 4 or 5 years, and then there was a conflict of interest because we were going to give money to Chautauqua, and I resigned. And that's when Dick Miller was named president, and he just retired after 25 years. Mm-hmm. So that shows when I was there, she was instrumental in my going on the Chautauqua board as well. But
how did they get? Tell me a little bit of the creation of the Gebbie Foundation. Where did the money come from to seed the Gebbie Foundation?
Well, Frank Gebbie, the father of Mrs. Bellinger, he knew Gail Borden way, way back. When he came from Scotland at the age of 5, they settled on the Hudson. And he married the daughter of a judge down there. Then his family apparently moved up to Cortland, New York, where he was canning fruit. And he decided to go back, follow the example of Gail Borden, and he set up a place outside of Utica, New York, and started the Mohawk Condensed Milk Company, and was very successful. And his daughter was Mrs. Bellinger, and she became Mrs. Bellinger later. She married one of the top men in the firm, and they bought a place over in Sherman, New York, and Corey, Pennsylvania, and that's how they got up here. And he had farms, and they had a place on the lake. She used to go hunting, as a matter of fact, with Murray Davidson. Did you ever hear of Murray Davidson?
Sure, yeah.
And he, well, anyway, then she bought extra lots. There were 60-foot lots, and she bought several of them and then built this home, she and her husband. But it turned out that he died before the home was finished. But she had lost a baby, and she wanted to have another baby, and a social worker said, "I have one, but I don't think you want her." "Well, just let me have her for a few weeks and a couple of months." And let's see, of course, it turned out that she kept the child, who turned out to be Mrs. Bellinger's daughter, who, when she was of high school age, Mrs. Bellinger used to rent the Dow House in Jamestown, and so her daughter could go to school, and she tried to get some of the young people at that time, like Dan Lincoln and others, to come out, but meet her daughter, but nothing ever took. Finally, her daughter went to a finishing school in Washington, and after finishing there, she went up, got an apartment up in New York, and that's where she met her husband, Bill Parker. And Bill Parker married the daughter who was the mother of Gebbie Parker and Bertram Parker. And I don't know whether I mentioned, but she got me interested in that, the
who's the state one?
Chautauqua Foundation.
Right.
And I was there for, I did tell you, I guess, for 25 years.
Yeah.
I mean, I was there only for 4 or 5 years, but Bill, Dick
Miller. Dick Miller.
Dick Miller took over.
Yeah.
So then in 1946, we lost a 15-year-old daughter who was killed in an automobile accident. She was the only one that was hurt. They were going to an Easter sunrise service, and up in the hills back of Canandaigua. And after that, my wife Faith didn't like, there were 6 in the car, and my daughter was the only one that was really hurt. So she used to see these other children, and that was what got us to look for another job. And in 1948, 2 years later, we came to Jamestown and the old National Chautauqua County Bank, and they were looking the present for someone to take over. And then Marine Midland bought us in '51, and I was president of the bank and stayed on as president until 1969 when I retired.
Well, that's great. Just think, and you were with Gebbie Foundation.
Before that, yes, Gebbie Foundation was started in '64. Russell Rogerson was our attorney, and Mrs. Bellinger had suggested that I be her executor, and I said, well, I couldn't be, but the bank would be glad to take it. And Rogerson said, we don't want to have a bank as executor, and so nothing ever came of that. And later on, he handled Mrs. Packard estate and got involved with the New York bank, and as a result, that New York banker became was one of the organizers of the Gebbie Foundation. Rogerson was the president, first president. Bill Parker, Mrs. Bellinger's daughter-in-law, became secretary, and he was both Mrs. Bellinger and her sister, Marion Gebbie, had this carnation stock, and they set up trust for him with Marine Midland. And so I left Marine Midland in '69 because of the conflict of interest, and we were giving money to Chautauqua Institution too then. So, well, anyway, Rogerson had gotten into trouble because the 2 sisters had owned a few shares in a small company, and he wanted to have the sisters sell their shares back to the company, so they'd be there in case they wanted to hire somebody to go, but that never happened. He turned the stock over to his daughters, and as a result of that, in the meantime, Mrs. Ballinger's daughter had died, and Bill Parker had remarried. When Bill Parker married a second wife, her sister knew about this thing that Rogerson had done, and she started the action against Rogerson. And so there was a long, drawn out, from up to 6 or 7 years it lasted, that action. And he had attorneys in Buffalo, and they said, and the Mrs. Parker's family said, we don't want to have any other lawyers in Jamestown or Buffalo because they're all in cahoots with Rogerson. So we got a Rochester attorney to come over. And Sue Stewart was our attorney. And
Oh, that's how she got involved, eh?
that's how we got her. And how we got over there. And of course then Rogerson had been president of the Gebbie Foundation the first few years, but when this suit was all over, I guess it must have been, was 69 that I became president, and I was president from then on.
Yeah. Fantastic. You told me the story. Do you want to take a little break now, John? You want something to drink, or you've been doing great?
No. Well, take a break, baby, but
Okay. Well, because I wanted to.
because I pressed hard for the Roger Tory Peterson.
Mm-hmm.
And are we on?
Yeah, go ahead.
And so we 1976, the Gebbie Foundation had provided funds for the Audubon Society house down there. The first building was ever built there, and long before the big building was built. And they called it the Roger Tory Peterson building, and he came, and right at that time, he had just had his third marriage. He married Virginia, and he said, and having married her, she was his third wife, I should say, but she was very good to him and took good care of him, and right up until his death. Anyway, right after that, Lorimer Moe, who was a friend of Roger Tory Peterson's back in high school, said, you know, we ought to do something for this native Jamestowner who's such a fine bird man, and he's a naturalist, and we should do something. So I picked up from then on, we pursued it, and the Jamestown Community College was interested, and Roger Seeger was then president of the college, and he was quite interested. But there was some questions to whether or not Roger Peterson would really give his money to this organization that might be set up locally. He wanted it to go to Cornell or to Yale, but it would be lost down there. But anyway, I went to community college, and Quint was on the board of the community college board at that time, and Roger Seeger was president, and we pursued it for 2 or 3 years, and there was some question whether or not he was going to give it to us, and he came one time 3 years later, 79, and he had his attorney, and was really a question of whether or not he was going to do anything about it. But at that time, there was a law being passed by Congress, and our Republican Congressman, Barber Carnival, we spoke to him, and he got a little clause put in that bill that if a artist gave his works to a foundation, he could still retain the royalties. And on the strength of that, I think Roger finally came through, but it was years later. That was in '79, and it wasn't until 84 that was started. And I think probably I alienated people on our board of the Gebbie Foundation because I pressed for it. We gave the first $2,500 to get it started, and then we gave money every month for a year or two until we got up to $3,150,000. And then a little later on, it looked as though the state of New York might help out, and they came up with $5 million, but it only gave $2 million outright, $3 million on a loan. And I persuaded Gebbie Foundation to give another $3 million, so we put up the building, and then we were really in business. But it hasn't been easy to raise money always since then. Can we stop just a minute? Got underway. And so altogether, Gebbie Foundation has given $6,150,000 to the Roger Torrey Peterson, and I'm sure they shouldn't be asked to give any more.
What, being so actively involved in the Gebbie Foundation for so long, John, as you had to reflect back, what was the biggest impact did you and the Gebbie Foundation have with the money that you gave away? What was the project or two that you feel the most proud of?
Well, all during that time, I was the treasurer at the time, and Rogerson was president, and I started buying stocks, and I bought AA and AAA stocks, and during the 30 years I was there, it increased from 10 million up to 60 million.
Fantastic.
And I've got the record here. Here's the whole history of the Gebbie Foundation, if you want to take a look at it. Maybe we ought to go off the air.
Sure.
Well, I guess there's nothing here you want to see.
As you reflect back on your years in the Gebbie, not only the growth and the principle of it all, but were there some programs that you're really proud of, John?
Well, the Roger Torrey
Peterson, yeah.
But I don't think that we did help the college quite a bit, and because I was always interested in the college. I have to stop and think a minute about if there was anything special.
You did some wonderful things in that challenge with the Chautauqua Institution.
Yes. And we've always done a lot for that because Mrs. Bellinger, as I said before, helped save it back. And I was on the board for 20 years, I guess. And I've always been interested in Chautauqua, but I never owned a place there. Faith, of course, has been gone now for this is her 10th year down, and it costs $45,000 a year to take care of her down there. We get a pretty good pension, I do, and she gets one also. And of course, if I go, she gets my pension as well. But physically, she's in pretty good shape, and but if anything happened to her, of course, did I tell you that we're going to be buried in Canandaigua?
No.
That's where our daughter was. And Lynn knows about it.
Mm-hmm.
We have a lot there, the marks for faith.
Mm-hmm. And you have a son and a daughter.
Oh, yes. Hope has been great in the last couple of years regarding the sale of the house. They, as you know, they took that big truckload and took it down to their new house, and then it took them 12 hours. And another week or two, Hope is going to come up, and I'll go down there for Thanksgiving and Christmas with the family. Right. And my grandson married a gal, and they have a daughter, so it's the first great-grandchild that I have.
Terrific.
She's 2 years old now. And she spent the weekend with the grandfather, my son.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry to break up.
Not at all. Not at all. And John, what is John doing?
Huh?
And John, what is he doing?
The grandson?
Your son.
Oh, you know he's a lawyer.
He's a lawyer.
And
he's managing partner, right?
He's managing partner of Hale and Dorr. And he was written up in the magazine, the Yale publication a short time ago, because his firm is the first one that's gone on computers. Are we on now?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
So that's what's happened. He's had a great career, and he's now 62, I think, and he will retire at 70. The firm, they will all retire at 70 from here on. Mm-hmm. Some of the older members have retired in the last year or two. So I guess that's the way it goes these days.
Our firm has a 70 years old mandatory retirement also.
Does it?
Yeah.
Well, that's the way this is.
Yeah.
It was nice to have a good visit with your father.
Oh.
What, may I ask, was his business?
His business was Jamestown Electroplating.
Oh.
And he was one of the owners there with a guy named L.A. Davis, Lawrence Davis,
Mm-hmm.
And Dick Davis.
Yeah.
It was a family affair, and my dad was one of the minority stockholders.
Excuse me.
Well, this has been utterly terrific, John.
Well,
It's just been, you're an institution around here. You've been for years and continue to be, and your involvement with JCC, Roger Troy Peterson, Gebbie Foundation, you name it.
Well.
If it's happened that's good in the area, it's been John Hamilton.
Well, I've been lucky to turn it off.
Okay. How much have you given? How much has the Gebbie Foundation given?
About $60 million.
Wow.
It started out with 10.
Yeah. Unbelievable.
And I think Buck right now appreciates the fact that maybe I did a good job.
Yeah, I'm sure.
But Diane is more or less in charge, and has been, and since the last 3 years we've had in these investment advisors that cost about $160,000 a year, And out of the blue, I called Buck to tell him that I thought that she should stay on, and he said, we already have increased her salary, and she is going to stay on, but all members of the board are not in entire agreement on that. But I have talked with Paul Sandberg since. I got to him the other night, and George Campbell, and for some reason or other, I think they have felt that maybe I did too much for the Roger Tory Peterson Institute. It really needs a big giver right now. I was hoping that someday Hugo Lindgren's sons were in. Have I told you about that?
No.
His sons were just a class ahead of Hope in high school, junior high, and they have played ping pong down in the basement of our house. And I talked with one of them who is now a lawyer in New York, and I told him that I would hope that they would do something for the Gebbie Foundation someday. Well, he didn't say no. And his brother is an investment man and has married. Bob has never married, and he is probably in his late 50s right now. And he's with a firm in New York. I should know the name. It's a very prominent name. Just two names that he's with. And it doesn't show up here. Well, anyway, I have the feeling that probably it's just that maybe when Hugo is no longer on the scene, they might do something in his, and then we could name the building for him. But I don't know if that'll ever happen. But
are you happy with the Roger Troy Peterson's will and how they're treating the institute here?
yes, he had a very smart lawyer. We had an agreement from Roger himself indicating he would turn all these things over to us. But his lawyer said that everything should be given to her, and then she'll turn it all over to us, but she'll get a deduction every time. So that was the lawyer's attitude. I don't know whether it was entirely legal or not, but I guess it must be. It's all right with me. We're getting.
You're getting it. Yeah. You're getting from Roger Tory Peterson estate what you were hoping to get, right?
That's right.
Great.
Which is a lot of things.
And with that, a challenge to kind of preserve that. I mean, that takes money.
Yeah. And now that we have the building, of course, with the building could be increased sometime if we ever were lucky enough. Virginia suggested that all the memorials be sent to the institute rather than to her or the family. I don't think an awful lot has come in, but maybe quite a little has. Not quite what we expected.
You've met a lot of important people, a lot of interesting people. Is there any one person or persons that has really made an influence on you, John, that impressed you over the years?
Well, offhand, I've gotten to know quite a few people, but I guess it's never centered on any one person. Oh, I do think that Dallas Beal is the finest man I've ever known. He's a real gentleman, and he worked his way through Ohio, and I understand he was the top of the class that year, but I'm not sure.
I heard that too, yeah.
Huh?
Ohio State, yeah.
And he grew up on a farm, as you well know. But now he's busy with the institute, with the college, because he's acting president, as you know. But I hope they get somebody fairly soon, because he doesn't give as much. He should give more time. And we are fortunate in having a good person in the form of Jim Barry. He's really a top guy, and he has a nice personality. Are we on?
Yeah, we are now, yeah.
I wanted to say something that I didn't want to put on it.
Okay. Tell me about your degree, Jen.
Well, I was given an honorary degree by Hamilton College, and it just happened that Elliot Richardson received an honorary degree at the same time. And I'd almost forgotten about it, but he had written this article in the last field guide. You should read it and get a copy of it, and there'll be another field guide coming out fairly soon. But he, I think, ascribed more credit to Paul Benke, because a lot happened before Paul was on the scene, back in Roger Seeger's day, when Quinn Anderson was on the board of the college, as I was at one time. And then, as you know, when I retired from the board, retired in '69, April 1st, I was asked to become acting president of the college, which I was glad to do. And it was a great year for me. And the Ed Cherry told me that when at the first faculty meeting, I said to the faculty that I wasn't an educator and I didn't propose to be one. I'd leave that up to my assistant, the dean, and the faculty. And he said, from that day on, he says, your day was made. So I had a good time, just 1 year, 69, 70, and I started out for just 2 or 3 months, but they continued, so I did continue through the year. And it was a great year, and didn't take too much time away from Gebbie Foundation.
And through that all, they renamed the campus center in your honor?
That was done when Paul Benke was responsible for that, when he came as 81. And now they've added to that building. They've done a lot of new building down there. I hope you've seen it.
I have, oh, yeah.
And Stan Weeks has given $250,000, and they have a Sarita Weeks room there now, which is nice. They hold meetings in it.
Well, you've been a terrific impact in this community, Jim.
Well, I don't know about that, but it's great that I no longer have much of any responsibility, because I don't have any energy.
You had a lot today. This was great. I've worked you pretty hard, and I really appreciate this.
Well, it's been nice to be with you. It's in no way my family want me to write up. I did start writing out every decade what had happened, but I got to the third, and then I, for some reason or other, got switched off, and I haven't done anything since. And I probably should do something for the family. But
well, we'll give them a copy of this. That'll fill in a few blanks.
Yeah, but it doesn't say too much about the family.
Yeah.
Although I guess I did tell you about my father.
Right.
Mother.
Now, how many brothers and sisters did you have, John?
There were 3 of us, brothers. I had an older one at 89. He died at 89, and he has a daughter living over in Batavia, and a son who lives in Bath. And I had a brother, Don Hamilton, who was with city service his entire career. He wound up out in Oklahoma City. He's in a retirement home out there now. And he's a great guy. He came to Hamilton College and played football and basketball all 4 years, and he has a bum knee as a result of it. And he is in a retirement home. He still drives his car, which I gave up several years ago. Am I on?
Sure. Tell me about your mother.
She had these 4 brothers, and they all were good singers. And then she married my father, and the 3 of us didn't know where middle C was. Maybe I've already said that.
Yeah, a little bit of, yeah, that's great now.
But she was a great woman.
What was her background? Where did she come from?
Well, she grew up on a farm just east of Batavia. Her father led the choir with a tuning fork, and these 4 brothers all were good singers, and 2 of them made careers in singing. But it didn't happen in my family, as I've said before. No. She went to the Boston Conservatory of Music. I'm glad that my daughter Hope has inherited some of her music ability. But now she married Bob Pettigrew, who plays by ear, and she had an excellent teacher when she went to what's the prep school that was taken over by Andover? Faith and I felt that our children should go to prep schools, and John went to Exeter, and Hope went to this prep school that was taken over by, I should remember the name, taken over by Andover. And as a matter of fact, when John finished, and these Ivy League colleges only take in so many from these 2 prep schools, and they cut off when John's name came up, and he wanted to go to Princeton. Well, I would like to have seen him go to Hamilton, but I had happened to know the president of Princeton board at that time, and Harold Helms, who was the president of a Princeton, as well as head of a big fund in New York. I was able to speak with him, and so John got into Princeton.
Terrific. Terrific.